Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Hidden History of the Southwest. This show is dedicated to bringing you the honest and accurate history of the American Southwest. Now, I am Hank Wilson, your host, and the show is based very much like my original podcast, The Hidden History of Texas, except we're going to cover a lot more ground here, and it's video also. Now, the American Southwest is generally considered, well, to me anyway, to include the states of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and Oklahoma. Now, each of those states has a rich and very diverse history, full of heroes and villains. Now, real history is often messy. Real history can and often does make some people uncomfortable. However, if we learn and understand the untold and often hidden stories that make up our nation, perhaps, maybe, hopefully, who knows, someday, we may all learn to live with one another. Boy, wouldn't that be an interesting change? So let's get started. Today, I want to talk about how Europeans go exploring and bump into a continent and are surprised to find people are already there. When Europeans first encountered what is now North, South, and Central America, the world was a very different place. Well, maybe not too different, because countries were fighting over land, gold, religion, natural resources, and political power, much like we do today. However, it was still different. There were no cars, planes, trains, buses, electricity, fast food joints, and certainly no TV, radio, mobile phones, internet. People traveled on horseback, on foot, or if they were near a coast or a river, by boat. Now, some of the upper class, they would travel by carriage. Now, however, not many mainland Europeans did much exploring. There were a few. But for the most part, until the late 1400s, people were pretty much content to simply exist and survive. After all, it was a hardscrabble life. Now, as the population grew, there were demands for new and improved ways of living, and that included goods from Asia, such as silk and various spices. Now, the original route they would have to take required a lengthy overland trip, which could and often did take months and even years to complete. And there had to be a better way. And some thought they should be able to sail to Asia, but there weren't many who were willing to try. And it cost a lot of money to embark on that type of adventure. Now finally, about 1488, Portugal became the first European country whose sailors were brave enough to sail out into the Atlantic Ocean. Well, actually they weren't. You see, my ancestors were the Vikings, and Vikings sailed the northern Atlantic around 1100 AD. But for the sake of this story, we'll give the Portuguese some credit. Now, the Portuguese exploration was primarily along the coast of Africa. Portuguese explorer Bartholomew Diaz was the first to sail around the Cape of Good Hope, which is the southern tip of Africa, and he made it to Asia. Now remember, most of the history you learned in school was written or influenced by Europeans, because it turns out that the Chinese Admiral Zheng He sailed all around Africa and Asia around 1404. Diaz was really the first European to do so, at least that is recognized. Now, Diaz's trip was important because if he hadn't made it, Europeans would have faced a much more difficult time traveling to Asia for trading purposes, as I've pointed out. So going by sea made the trip manageable and helped to speed up economic development of the European nations. Now, of course, Portugal claimed everything that Diaz touched or saw. Therefore, any ship that dared to follow the same route risked encroaching on Portuguese territory. However, his success did lead mariners from other nations to wonder if there might be a shorter way to Asia that did not encroach on Portuguese routes. Now, even though people did wonder about a shorter route, there were few nations with the capability to send ships out into the Atlantic to find an answer. Now, things changed when Isabella of Castile and her husband Ferdinand II of Aragon succeeded in driving out the Muslims who had ruled southern Spain for over 300 years. They united the country under a Roman Catholic flag. Now, the changeover of Spanish government was completed by 1492, and it was at that time that Christopher Columbus convinced the monarchs that by finding a western route to India, Spain would have increased military, economic, and just as important, religious power. Now, as many remember from American history classes in grade school, children are taught that Christopher Columbus discovered America. In truth, while he was one of the first Europeans, right now I won't talk about my ancestors, the Vikings, who landed on the coast of Canada 300 years earlier to reach what was in his time the New World. He didn't really discover a new world. Well, it was new to him, so okay. In 1492, he encountered the islands now known as the Bahamas, Cuba, and Hispaniola. In 1493, he landed in our current Puerto Rico. All islands inhabited by people whose ancestors had been there for hundreds, if not thousands of years. As was the European custom, Columbus claimed all of the land he encountered for Spain. 3 years later, in 1496, the Spanish put their first settlement in Santo Domingo in what is now the Dominican Republic. Now, from those early arrival points and settlements, the Spanish began to explore the region, mapping the shorelines of any land they encountered and still looking for a shortcut to India. By 1501, Spanish sailors had explored all the way up to what Newfoundland and Labrador in present-day Canada is now. To reach what is now North America from the islands, it was inevitable that the ships would bump into Florida. The early explorers thought that Florida was in fact another island. In 1519, the same year that Hernan Cortez, landed near what is Veracruz and began his conquest of the Aztec Empire, the governor of Jamaica, Francisco de Garay, sent out an expedition. He ordered Lieutenant Alonso Alvarez de Pineda to explore what was considered an unknown country between the Rio Panuco of Mexico, which empties near current-day Tampico, Mexico, and the island of Florida. Now, Alvarez de Pineda set out with 4 ships and 270 men to explore. He sailed into the waters of what the world knows as the current Gulf of Mexico. Upon reaching the west coast of Florida and sailing north, he encountered nothing but more land. The results of this was the awareness that, what do you know, Florida was not an island. Finally, the ships then turned to port, which is left, and for several weeks sailed along the coast towards the sunset. On June 2, 1519, Alvarez first saw the mighty Mississippi. He then reached the low coast and barrier islands of Texas in late June and July of 1519. He called the land Michel. We know of this name from 2 sources: the royal patent granted Francisco de Garay, Alvarez's sponsor, to settle the region, and a map published in 1524 known as the Cortez Map. As a result of this journey and encounters with native peoples living along the coast, the Spanish explorers knew there was more territory inland. They also knew there were native peoples living along the coast, but that's about all they knew until around 1534. Now, that's the European side of the early part. But well before the Spanish accidentally discovered the continent, as I mentioned, there were a lot of people living here. Well, where did they come from? When we study the indigenous peoples of New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, and Oklahoma, we find a population that is very diverse and incredibly complex. There is not one homogeneous group. The history actually covers a time span of several thousand years and melds together an incredibly wide range of cultures and groups. The earliest inhabitants, which included what scholars label the Paleo-Indians, apparently migrated onto the continent from Asia. The groups that followed them evolved to better survive in their new land adapted to their environment. The ancestral Pueblans, Anasazi, Hohokam, and Mogollon peoples all thrived in the Southwest, particularly in the New Mexico area. In fact, New Mexico is the home of the ancestral Pueblans, including the ancestors of the Taos and Acoma Pueblo, and are among the oldest continuously inhabited places in the United States. They are truly the original inhabitants of the Southwest America. okay, or the American Southwest. The Paleo group were nomadic hunters and gatherers, and they followed the herds of large game like mammoths and bison. Now, here in Texas, there are Paleo Indian sites such as the Galt site, which is actually close to my home base here in Central Texas, which have yielded evidence of Clovis and Folsom cultures dating back 13,000 years. Now, it was around 200 AD that three major culture areas emerged in the Southwest: the ancestral Puebloan, Hohokam, and Mugoyan, the Mogollon. That's a great word. You should hear how it's pronounced and mispronounced in Arizona, especially when people are new to the area. I mispronounce it all the time, and I don't really mean to. Ancestral Pueblans, Anasazi. This group was centered in the Four Corners area, which is the current states of Arizona, New Mexico in the south, and it touches the borders of Utah and Colorado. This group is known for their incredible architecture. Their sites show they built multi-story dwellings and kivas, which are beautiful, incredibly gorgeous. They're round ceremonial rooms, and they had very distinctive pottery. They were truly impressive and creative. The Hohokam were an agricultural people whose people were sustained by the use of irrigation canals in the desert. In fact, they developed a sophisticated agricultural system in the desert that could easily put modern agricultural systems to shame. The Maguyon lived in the Gila wilderness and the Mimbres River Valley, and they're widely known for their beautiful pottery and unique burial customs. Now, coming into the area later were both the Navajo and the Apache. They were nomadic groups who immigrated from the northern regions into the Southwest between 1200s and 1500s. They adapted to the environment, were very successful hunters, gatherers, and raiders. Yes, they would raid their neighbors and take what they needed. And the Apache were actually some of the very best to ever ply the trade of raiding. Now, in what is now Oklahoma, tribes such as the Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, Osage, and Caddo lived and roamed the area. In Texas, the Caddo, Comanche, Wichita, Jumanos, and Apache were a few of the major tribes that lived in Texas. The Caracancas were among the first to greet the Spanish. The Comanche were known as Lords of the Plains, and they dominated vast areas of the regions. The Apaches in Texas were a very diverse group of tribes, including the Chiricahua, the Jihuria, the Lipan, the Mescalero, and Western Apaches, known for their nomadic lifestyle. Now, over the course of this show, I'll talk more about the specific groups or confederations of people because their history is our history. Next episode, I'll talk about the Spanish exploration timeline, and we'll meet the first groups of indigenous people they meet. This has been the Hidden History of the Southwest.